In 1934, a farmer named Earl Guthrie walked out of a dust storm in the Oklahoma Panhandle with nothing but a burlap sack, a folding knife, and the knowledge his own father had pressed into him before he could read. He found water in a dry creek bed by digging 18 inches into the outer bend of a curve. He started a fire with a piece of glass from his broken pocket watch. He patched a bleeding gash on his forearm with pine sap and a strip of his own shirt. He walked 11 miles to the nearest town, arrived before dark, and never thought of it as remarkable. He thought of it as Tuesday. His grandson told this story at a family reunion in 2003, and half the room had no idea what he meant by any of it. Number 25. Reading the land for water. Before plastic bottles and municipal plumbing, finding water was not a camping skill. It was the first skill. American grandfathers who worked ranches, farms, and homesteads understood that water announces itself if you know the language. Willows and cottonwoods grow where roots can reach moisture within 20 feet of the surface. Dry creek beds hold water beneath the sand at the outer curve of every bend, where the current slows and deposits happen deepest. Morning dew collects heaviest in low spots where cold air settles overnight. Canyon walls that face north stay damp longer than walls that face south. A grandfather in the Texas Hill Country could scan a ridgeline and tell you within a quarter mile where to dig. His grandson can unlock a phone and search for the nearest gas station. That grandfather's knowledge kept cattle drives alive when no device existed to keep them alive for him. Number 24. Fire without matches. The generation that built this country made fire every single day of their lives, and they did not always have matches. The bow drill method, a technique inherited from indigenous peoples and carried forward through 2 centuries of American frontier life, required a straight spindle of dry softwood, a fireboard of matching material, a bow strung with a leather cord, and a notch cut at precisely the right angle to catch the coal. The skill was not difficult. It required practice, dry materials, and the understanding that friction creates heat. Heat creates coal, and coal survives only if you move it quickly into a prepared tinder bundle. Men who knew this skill could produce fire in under 3 minutes. The skill was taught to boys before they were 10 years old because in a world without central heating, fire was not comfort. They have outsourced the oldest human competency to a piece of plastic that costs 99 cents and fails rain. Number 23. Butchering an animal. A farm in 1920 did not call a service when it needed meat. The grandfather knew how to dispatch, bleed, skin, and quarter an animal cleanly, efficiently, and without waste. He knew that bleeding happens fast after dispatch, and that delay means spoiled meat. He knew that the hide came off in sheets if you worked the knife flat against the membrane. He knew which cuts were which organs were edible and nutrient-dense, and which scraps went into the lard bucket or the soup pot. Nothing was thrown away because nothing could afford to be. Families that wasted meat went hungry. The knowledge was not squeamishness-free. It required a person to be honest about where food came from. That honesty was not brutal. The men and women who butchered their own animals understood the full cost of the meal on their plate. Number 22. Preserving food without refrigeration. The root cellar was an engineering solution. Packed earth, 12 to 15 cooler than surface temperature year-round, held apples, turnips, potatoes, carrots, and cabbages through the worst winters on record. But the grandfather's preservation knowledge went beyond cold storage. He understood salt curing, the process of drawing moisture from meat until bacterial growth became impossible. He understood fermentation, the controlled cultivation of beneficial bacteria in crocks of cabbage, beans, and dairy that not only preserved food, but made it nutritionally superior to the fresh original. He understood smoking and the specific woods that imparted preservation without bitterness. The average American household today holds 3 days of food if the power goes out, and almost no knowledge of how to extend it further. Number 21. Tracking animals. The skill is older than agriculture, and the grandfathers who worked the land never forgot it. A deer track in soft mud told a practiced eye the animal's size, speed, direction, and how recently it had passed. A broken stem at knee height told a different story than one broken at shoulder height. Scat location and composition revealed diet health, and seasonal patterns. Grandfathers who hunted for sustenance rather than sport moved through the woods reading a continuous text that most modern people cannot even see. The knowledge was practical, not mystical. Here is where the truth of this list gets uncomfortable. These skills did not disappear because they became unnecessary. They disappeared because an entire industrial system was built around replacing them with purchased substitutes, and then convincing 2 generations of Americans that not knowing things was a sign of progress. The man who could preserve his own meat was replaced by the refrigerator. The woman who could grow and dry her own herbs was replaced by the spice aisle. The farmer who could read weather and clouds and wind was replaced by the weather app. Every skill on this list represented a form of independence that someone decided was inconvenient for the modern economy. Independent people buy less. People who cannot do things for themselves buy everything. The grandfathers knew things. We were sold the idea that knowing things was old-fashioned. Number 20. Reading weather by observation. A grandfather who had farmed or ranched for 30 years did not need a forecast. He read the sky the way a navigator reads a chart. A halo around the moon meant precipitation within 24 hours caused by high cirrus ice crystals that precede an incoming front. Red sky at morning was not folklore. It was physics. Morning red light scatters from moisture and dust in the east, indicating the dry air has already passed and wet air is approaching from the west. A drop in barometric pressure, which old-timers felt in their joints before they understood the science, meant storms were building. Cumulus clouds that grew vertically through the afternoon meant thunderstorms by evening. The grandfathers who got their hay in before the rain and the ones who lost a crop to weather were often separated by nothing more than the quality of their observation. The grandfathers who got their hay in before the rain were not lucky. They were watching. Number 19. Setting snares and traps. The ability to catch food without being present to catch it is one of the most efficient survival skills ever developed. A well-set snare, positioned on an active game trail with the loop at the right height for the target animal, catches food while the setter sleeps. Great-grandfathers in the Appalachian backcountry, the northern woods, and the western plains built snare lines that ran for miles, checked twice daily, that provided steady protein through months when hunting was impractical. The figure 4 deadfall trap, assembled from 3 sticks and a heavy flat rock, required no purchase materials and could be set in 3 minutes by a person who understood the geometry. Trapping for sustenance was regulated out of casual practice through most of the 20th century as wildlife populations collapsed and recovered and the knowledge retreated with it. The general knowledge of how to feed yourself without being present to do the feeding is almost completely gone. Number 18. Wound care and field medicine. A farmer in the early 20th century was 6 miles from the nearest doctor on a good road. He was not calling an ambulance for a gash from a plow blade or a puncture from a fence post. He cleaned wounds with spirits or boiled water because he understood, even without formal germ theory, that dirty wounds killed people and clean ones healed. He packed deep wounds with clean cloth and held pressure because he understood that stopping blood loss was the first priority. He used plantain leaves, which grew in every disturbed soil in North America, as a drawing poultice because generations of use had confirmed the effect. He knew that a wound that turned red and hot and sent red lines tracking up toward the body needed a doctor regardless of distance, because that was blood poisoning, and blood poisoning killed. This was confidence born of necessity, passed from mother to daughter and father to son across generations. Number 17. Rope work and knot tying. The bull line, the clove hitch, the trucker's hitch, the sheet bend. These were not sailors' curiosities. They were everyday tools for every working American who handled livestock, moved loads, built structures, or secured anything that needed to stay put under load. A grandfather who ran cattle knew that a knot tied wrong in a roping situation was a knot that got someone killed. The knowledge collapsed when nylon straps replaced manila rope, and the next generation never had a reason to understand what the knots were built for. Number 16. Natural navigation without instruments. The North Star sits within one of true north and has never failed anyone who could find it in a clear sky. The sun rises slightly north of due east in summer and south of due east in winter, tracks due south at noon, and sets in its corresponding western position. A stick pressed vertically into flat ground casts a shadow that moves from west to east as the morning progresses, and a line connecting the tip of an early shadow to the tip of a later shadow points true east-west. Moss grows thickest on the north face of trees in the northern hemisphere, where sunlight is least. Grandfathers who worked in wilderness, who drove cattle, scouted timber, or simply knew their land, moved across it with the confidence of a man who understood his position relative to the sky and the earth without needing a device to tell him. Number 15. Sharpening blades properly. A dull knife is more dangerous than a sharp one because it requires more force, which means less control. Every grandfather who worked with tools understood this and maintained his edges accordingly. The whetstone, used with the correct angle and the correct pressure, brought a blade back to working sharpness in under 5 minutes. The strop, a length of leather charged with honing compound, refined that edge to surgical precision. The grandfather who sharpened his own tools kept them for 30 years. The grandfather who sharpened his own tools kept them for 30 years. His grandson buys replacements because sharpening seems harder than ordering new. Here is something that does not get said directly enough. The skills on this list are not independent of each other. They form a system. A man who could track an animal, set a snare, butcher the catch, preserve the meat, and dress any wound that happened along the way was not a collection of skills. He was a complete person in the oldest sense of the word. He was somebody who the land could not defeat because he knew the land's language. The modern world did not just take away individual competencies. It took away the coherence of a way of knowing, the understanding that the physical world operates by rules that a person can learn, and that learning those rules is the deepest form of freedom available to a human being. What replaced it was not freedom. Number 14. Soap and candle making. Lye from wood ash, rendered fat from butchering, water, and time. Those 4 things produced soap that cleaned bodies, clothes, and wounds for generations of American families who could not afford or could not reach a store. The process required precision because lye is caustic, and the ratio of lye to fat determined whether the result was soap or a skin-burning disaster. But the knowledge was widespread because the need was universal. Candle making from tallow or beeswax required the same basic relationship with rendered materials. A household that could make its own soap and its own light was a household that could function through any disruption of commerce. Number 13. Building and maintaining a root cellar. The design was elegant in its simplicity. You dug into a north-facing hillside deep enough that the surrounding earth held a stable temperature regardless of surface conditions, framed the entry against collapse, ventilated the space to prevent moisture accumulation, and created a storage environment that kept produce viable through the hardest winter. The grandfather who built his root cellar built it once and used it for 40 years. He understood thermal mass, the principle that a large volume of earth changes temperature slowly and holds a moderate temperature when the surface swings between extremes. Number 12. Seed saving and selection. Before hybrid seeds and agricultural supply companies, 90 Yeknil, Medicaid, and Nexus, every farm was its own seed bank. The grandfather saved seed from the strongest plants, the ones that produced most prolifically, resisted disease most effectively, and survived the particular conditions of his specific land. Over generations, this selection pressure produced locally adapted varieties that outperformed commercial seed on local soil because they had been selected by that soil for decades. It is now a specialized practice, while the majority of American food production depends on purchased seed that cannot be legally saved. Number 11. Reading and treating livestock health. A rancher or farmer who could not diagnose basic illness in his animals was a man who watched his investment die. The grandfathers who worked with animals learned to read posture, gait, eye condition, coat quality, breathing rate, and appetite as indicators of health status. They knew what bloat looked like and that it required immediate intervention. They knew the difference between a horse favoring a foot from a stone bruise and one favoring it from a developing abscess that would go septic without drainage. They knew which plants in their pastures were toxic and in what quantities. They administered basic treatments because the veterinarian was not coming out for a sick pig at midnight in November. Number 10. Hand tool woodworking. A grandfather with a handsaw, a plane, a set of chisels, and a mallet could build a door, a piece of furniture, a window frame, or a set of cabinet boxes without a single powered tool. The skills required understanding wood grain direction because cutting against the grain produces tear out and splitting. They required understanding joinery, the mechanical connection of two pieces of wood without nails or hardware, because hardware rusted and failed, but a well-cut mortise and tenon lasted a century. They required the patience to take light passes with a sharp plane rather than heavy passes with a dull one. A man who could work wood by hand was a man who could maintain and repair his own home indefinitely without waiting for a contractor or a hardware delivery. Number 9. Foraging for wild edibles. The eastern woodland, the prairie, and the western mountains are full of food that most Americans walk past without recognition. The grandfather who knew his land knew where the pawpaws grew in the river bottom, when the morel mushrooms emerged after the first warm spring rains, where the wild onions pushed through the early April soil, and which berries in which season were safe and nutritious. This knowledge was not casual. It was exact. The grandfather who harvested wild mushrooms knew the difference between the edible and the deadly because he had learned from someone who had learned from someone, and any break in that chain of knowledge carried mortal consequences. Number 8. Animal husbandry for small farms. Chickens, pigs, goats, and a milk cow were not livestock enterprises. They were a complete food system. A grandfather who kept these animals managed protein, fat, dairy, and egg production from a homestead that could fit on a few acres. He understood breeding cycles, gestation periods, nutritional requirements, and the management of pasture rotation that kept his animals healthy without purchased inputs. He understood that a milk cow bred at the right time produced a calf that became next winter's beef, and a continuous supply of milk through the lactation cycle. Number 7. Well digging and water sourcing. The grandfather who needed water on land that had none did not wait for municipal infrastructure. He read the land for geological indicators. The same willows in low areas that marked water from the surface, but also the angle and composition of rock formations that indicated aquifer depth, the presence of springs along fault lines, and the behavior of existing water sources in drought years. Number 6. Tanning hides. A hide removed from an animal is not leather. It is organic material that will rot within days without intervention. Here is what nobody says about this list plainly enough. These are not skills for the end of the world. They are not prepper fantasies or doomsday preparations. They are the skills that built this country, that fed its families, that kept its people alive and independent across 2 centuries of hard winters, economic collapses, crop failures, and wars. The grandfathers who carried these skills were not extraordinary men. They were ordinary men who had been properly educated by the world they lived in. They knew how to feed themselves, shelter themselves, heal themselves, and keep their families alive, because that is what education meant before education became about employment. The question is not whether these skills are useful in the modern world. They are. Number 5. Basic blacksmithing. The forge was the hardware store, the machine shop, and the repair facility of the pre-industrial American farm. A grandfather with a forge, an anvil, a hammer, and the knowledge to use them could repair broken tools, fabricate hinges and hooks and brackets, reset horseshoes, and reshape metal parts that would otherwise require a trip to town and a cash expenditure a struggling farm could not afford. The knowledge of how to heat steel to working temperature by color, how to move metal with hammer and anvil, and how to quench and temper a finished edge was widely distributed through American rural life through the first decades of the 20th century. Number 4. Celestial timekeeping. Before wristwatches became mass-market items in the 1920s, American grandfathers told time by the sky with accuracy sufficient for every practical purpose. The sun at its highest point in the sky indicated noon, local solar time, from which a person could calculate the remaining hours of daylight and plan accordingly. Seasonal changes in sunrise and sunset timing were known by observation and used to schedule planting, harvest, and livestock management through the year. The stars moved across the night sky in predictable patterns that served as a clock for anyone working or traveling after dark. Number 3. Medicinal plant identification and preparation. The pharmacopoeia of the American grandfather was not purchased from a store. It grew along fence rows in disturbed soil, in woodland edges, and in the damp areas near water that every working farm contained. Yarrow, which stopped bleeding and reduced fever, grew in every disturbed soil in North America. Elderberry, which the modern supplement industry now sells for $30 a bottle, grew as a common hedgerow shrub from which any grandmother could make syrup in an afternoon. Number 2. Structural repair without contractors. A leak in the roof, a rotting sill beam, a cracked foundation, a failing chimney. The grandfather did not call anyone. He assessed the problem with his own eyes and his own understanding of how structures worked, gathered the materials required, and fixed it. He understood that a chimney crack left through a second winter became a chimney that came through the ceiling. He understood that a rotting sill beam left unaddressed transferred its load to adjacent members until the wall shifted. He understood the relationship between water infiltration and structural decay well enough to trace a leak backwards from where it appeared to where it entered, which are rarely the same place. This was not the specialized knowledge of a trained contractor. Number 1. Teaching. The skill that underlies every skill on this list is the one that made all the others possible across generations. The American grandfather did not take a class in firemaking. He did not watch a video about water finding. He did not read a manual about butchering or tanning or knotwork or plant medicine. He sat beside a man who knew, and he watched, and he practiced, and he was corrected, and he practiced again until the knowledge became his. And when his time came, he sat beside a boy and passed it on. The chain of transmitted knowledge that built this country ran through living human beings, through the patience of men who understood that making someone else capable was the most important work they could do. That chain did not break because the knowledge became wrong. It broke because a generation decided that children needed to be prepared for the economy rather than for the world, and that what a grandfather knew about fire and water and rope and plants and weather was not relevant to a life of office work and purchased convenience. The grandfathers are still dying, and more of what they knew dies with them every year. What remains is the record, and the record says that ordinary people once knew how to live in the physical world with a completeness and a confidence that we have not yet found a way to replace. Here is the challenge. Pick one skill from this list. Just one. Find the oldest person in your family and ask them what they remember. Ask what their father knew. Ask what their grandfather did. Because somewhere in that conversation, you will find something real, something that was not taught in any school, was not sold in any store, and is not available on any platform.